question. It's a long and complicated question, but the gist of it is that the person is from a Buddhist background and has found my videos, I guess, and heard some of them, and is confused about the differences between what I'm saying and what his view is of what the Buddhist religion is saying, what the Buddha's teachings are saying. So he's trying to see if there's a way to reconcile this. And I'll put the whole question in the description, you can see it, but I'm just going to comment on it along the way. So here's what the person is saying. I wanted to share some things on the Pali Canon, the scriptures that the Theravada Buddhist tradition uses. I'm sharing this because after reading many things on your website, I found myself agitated by trying to hold views about God or about having a worthy self. Additionally, trying to have a view about having a spiritual self also produces agitation that is not there when I do not try to cling to such an identity. The same is true for these ideas of having an impermanent self and a possibility of developing some permanent self. To me, it seems like these fall under this net of views outlined in the sutta above, wherein one is sort of trapped by having such views of a self. Okay, so let me comment on this, because there are two things you have to realize if you want to find some kind of resolution between what I'm saying today and what the Buddha said 2,500 years ago. You have to realize that what was said 2,500 years ago was based on what people knew about human psychology at the time, the level of the collective consciousness at the time. The Buddha, even though he had the ultimate wisdom, he was limited by what he could tell people by their understanding or lack of understanding. So the Buddha could give certain teachings 2,500 years ago. Jesus could give certain teachings 2,000 years ago. But today, the Ascended Masters, who are our timeless spiritual teachers and existed at the time of the Buddha, can give us more teachings because we have more understanding of ourselves, the human psychology, and the world. So you have to realize that where did the Buddha get his teachings from? He was actually connected to the Ascended Masters. Where did Jesus get his teachings from? He was actually connected to the Ascended Masters, just as we today have the potential to connect to the Ascended Masters. And this goes against the official Buddhist religion, the official Christian religion, I realize that. But what I'm saying is, at the time of the Buddha, he reacted to he attained Buddhahood in a society that was dominated by the Hindu religion, which was dominated by these brahmans. And the brahmins didn't have really one established doctrine because they were somewhat in disagreement with each other, different groupings, different views. But one of the things they had very strongly in Hinduism was this idea of the Atma, which is like the ultimate self, a permanent, unchanging self. And it's very important to realize that the Buddha said he had never discovered a permanent, unchanging self in himself. But that is not the same as the Buddha saying there is no self. There are some people that interpret it that way. That is not correct. There's actually a YouTube channel called Dog's Dharma, where there's a Western man who gives a lot of really good videos about Buddhism. And he talks about this, the Buddha's teachings on non-self, and you can easily find that. And he's saying the same thing, and I've read the same thing from other Buddhist scholars, that the Buddha didn't say there is no self. He said there's no permanent, unchanging self, which is also what I'm saying. I am saying, as the person is saying, there's a spiritual self. Because what we can more easily grasp today with our view of the world, our view of energy, for example, is that we live in a material world which is made up of energies that vibrate at a certain spectrum. And beyond that is the spiritual realm, which the Buddha really didn't talk much about for various reasons that I'm not going to go into here because it's too lengthy. But anyway, so what the Ascended Masters is telling us today is that, as I explained in my video about how the world was created, we are living in an unascended sphere where nothing is really permanent. And the core of who we are in this sphere is what I call the conscious you, which is an extension of our spiritual self, the I Am Presence. And the I Am Presence exists in the spiritual realm, which means it cannot be destroyed by anything that happens here on earth. No matter what mayhem that we might be exposed to here on earth, the I Am Presence can't be destroyed by it, neither can the conscious you. But the I Am Presence is not a permanent, unchanging being. It's in the process of qualifying for the ascension, and as part of that, it's sent the conscious you down here to have experiences in the denser realm of the undescended sphere. So the I Am Presence is growing, the conscious you is growing, and once you experience that, it's not a matter of intellectually understanding it, but once you experience that, you can see that there is really no contradiction between this and what the Buddha said. Because the Buddha was clearly saying there is some kind of self that can follow the Eightfold Path. There is some kind of self that is now trapped in illusion and suffering, but can free itself from this by walking the Eightfold Path. If there was no self, who is walking the Eightfold Path? And you can look at it another way and say, what is the Buddha saying, really? He was saying, if you walk the Eightfold Path, you become a Buddha. You attain the Buddha consciousness. But you only do that by the conscious you coming into oneness with your higher self, your spiritual self. And also by the spiritual self reaching a certain state of attainment or consciousness. So I understand what the person is saying, that there's this net of views, because the Buddha in the Pali Canon, he several times talks about, as I said, all of these views that were aired by the Hindu brahmins. And they had a lot of theories about this, intellectual theories. The self is like this, the self is like that. And the Buddha was saying these were wrong views because they prevent your self-transcendence. So basically you can say what the Buddha is saying is, there is a self that's walking the path, but you cannot allow yourself in the outer intellectual reasoning mind to create a fixed image of what that self is like. Because then you trap yourself in that image. You become trapped by your own image. And that's why you have to have this view that there's no fixed self, it's constantly transcending itself. And that is exactly the view that I'm saying. The I Am Presence is constantly growing, and the conscious you is constantly growing. And the spiritual path is really that the conscious you comes to disidentified self from the outer personality that is fixed. This is who you are. You were born there, so this is who you are. This is how you're supposed to live your life. You transcend all of that because you are really, as I said, neutral awareness, pure awareness. You are not bound by anything that happens in the world. Okay, so to avoid it being too long, let's go on here. There were any of those contemplatives and brahmans who are adherents of eternalism, proclaim an eternal self and cosmos on 4 grounds. That is just an agitation and vacillation to be felt by those contemplatives and brahmans who, not knowing, not seeing, are immersed in craving. So this is a quote from the Pali Canon. So what I'm saying is that there were all these views held by the Brahmins. And the Buddha, and you will see this, whenever a new teaching is brought out, it often has to challenge the existing teaching. And this is because what I have said in several cases, that the Ascended Masters are universal spiritual teachers. And they are constantly seeking to help us grow. But they also observe that when they give a certain spiritual teaching, after a while, people get stuck in the outer teaching, the form of the teaching. So that's why they give a new teaching. And the new teaching must often challenge the old to shake people out of their being stuck in the teaching. And that's why the Buddha challenged the Brahmins. But what you see also is that it only took a few hundred years after the Buddha was no longer there, that Buddhism split into several factions, and that we're now having these very intellectual discussions, just like the Hindu Brahmins, about this or that interpretation. So you can go on with all of this. And so there's a long quote here from the Pali Canon, but it's basically the same thing that I've already said. So what I'm saying here, so let's go on to the next. It really seems to me that in Buddhism, not self is a very important teaching, but in your teachings there are so many references to a true self or an eternal creator. And while I do not really know whether or not that is true, it seems to be in Buddhism that the Buddha has not taught about an eternal or non-eternal cosmos, because teaching either way is not conducive to dispassion, not conducive to the Dhamma, not conducive to liberation. And there's a validity to this, because as I said, the Buddha appeared in a certain cultural context with Hinduism dominating people's thinking. And Hinduism had a very fixed view of God. There were many gods and this and that. So the Buddha took a different approach to this. He basically said, let's take a practical approach. Let's not try to settle all these cosmological questions. And the reason for this is very simple. I have talked about in several of my videos how most people on earth are stuck in what I call the illusion that we are separate beings, which means we are in a state of mind where we're using the duality consciousness that always has two opposite polarities to define our worldview. And this worldview is basically always an illusion. But we don't see that it's an illusion. We think it's the absolute truth. So what we do is we become very, very attached to our explanations. And so the Buddha, in my view, saw that people were so trapped in all these discussions. And he said, let's take a different approach. Let's not address any of this. Let's not address it. Let's instead give a practical path for people to raise their consciousness beyond duality, because then they can see more clearly how to deal with these cosmological questions. This isn't the final approach that the Buddha took, but it was a very practical approach at the time. It's just, again, what has happened since the Buddha's time is humankind has increased our understanding of the cosmos, of our psychology, and many people today are in a state of mind where they are ready and they want to have a higher understanding of how the world works. I know I myself, even as a child, I longed for a higher understanding of how the world works that made sense to me, that resonated with me. And I could not have been satisfied with the Buddha's teachings as they were given 2,500 years ago. It wouldn't have been enough for me. I needed to have some understanding of the big cosmological questions. And I met many, many spiritual people on the path in these 49 years who had the same thing. We need to have some understanding of it. It doesn't need to be the ultimate one, but we need to have a certain worldview that we can fit ourselves into. And that's what the Ascended Masters are doing today. So they're saying, times have moved on, now we're giving more of these cosmological teachings, as I put in a very concentrated form in my video about how the world was created. So anyway, a person has several examples. And then he says, when someone talks about experiencing everything as consciousness or everything as the Creator's consciousness, isn't that akin to experiencing the realm of the infinitude of consciousness? In Buddhism, it's stated that that is a realm, but that there is an even higher, more refined realm, which is the realm of nothingness, and that even that realm is not to be grasped at. Yes, well, you see again, the Buddha basically said, let's not even talk about God, but today we can talk about there was a being who created our world of form. It's what I call the Creator. But as I also explained in How the World Was Created briefly, the Creator has created our world of form. Now, first of all, there are other worlds of form beyond ours. But these worlds of form exist in a certain realm where there can be a world that starts at a certain level and evolves to a higher level. But beyond this realm of these worlds of form, evolving worlds of form, there is what the masters call the allness, where there isn't that same dynamic of a world starting, created out of the Creator's being and then evolving. So to me, this is what the Buddha referred to as the realm of nothingness, because the allness is so beyond what we see in our world of form that we cannot take anything we see in the world of form and project it onto the allness, which is what we always tend to do. We always tend to take our state of consciousness and project it onto something. And that's why I think the Buddha said that there's a more refined realm, is the realm of nothingness. Because in that realm there is nothing we can compare to the things in our world. That's why our intellects cannot grasp what this is like, this realm is like. And that's why it's called nothingness. So, you know, I don't really think I can go into everything here because the person has so many things, but the person says in the end, I'm curious about what you think of all this, whether you see a way your views are reconciled with these teachings or whether you do not. I'm searching for the truth. And as I said, I think there can be a certain reconciliation, even between the teachings of Hinduism or Christianity and what the Ascended Masters are giving today. But you can't necessarily do a one-on-one. So in other words, you can't look at a certain concept from Buddhism and say, this corresponds exactly to what the Ascended Masters are saying today. But you can certainly find parallels. So, and the reason why I'm saying this is, again, when the Buddha gave a certain concept 2,500 years ago, it was given in context. Every teaching in words is given in context. It's very, very important to you for you to realize this. You can have a spiritual teacher that has the highest understanding, but when that teacher expresses the teaching in words, the words are always given in context because words have a meaning to people, an interpretation. And the way people gave meaning to words 2,500 years ago is not the same as the way we're doing it today. That's what I've been trying to say. And that's why sometimes you can't find an exact one-on-one correspondence between this concept given 2,500 years ago and a concept given today. But you can certainly find a reconciliation so that you can migrate from an older teaching to a newer teaching, if you are willing to look beyond the older teaching. Because if you take the older teaching literally, and that's what I see many people doing from all religions, you have all these intellectual discussions about what it means and how to interpret scriptures, then you cannot reconcile it. It can only be done intuitively. It's basically, you know, what the Ascended Masters are saying is this. The purpose of a spiritual teaching is not that you sit there with the intellect, with the reasoning mind, with the analytical mind, and interpret the teaching based on that level of mind, and split words and say, this means that, or this should be interpreted that way. That's not the purpose, because that's when you become attached to the outer form of the teaching. So, the purpose of a spiritual teaching, a teaching is always given from spiritual teachers in the spiritual realm. The Buddha didn't come up with his teachings on his own. He was connected to the Ascended Masters he was working with, and the teaching came from there. So the purpose of the spiritual teaching is really to give you an outer tool for attuning your consciousness to the beings who originated the teaching. And the Buddha, after he left the physical body, became one of these Ascended Masters, ascended beings. So the purpose of Buddhism, the outer teachings, the outer scriptures of Buddhism, is not to sit there and split hairs about what this means, but to intuitively connect to the Buddha as he exists today in the spiritual realm, as a spiritual being, as an ascended master. That's the real purpose of Buddhism, as it is the real purpose of Christianity, of Hinduism, of Taoism, any religion. And so the real question is, are people so attached to the outer form of the teaching that they won't look beyond it? Are they so attached to interpreting, understanding the teaching? Or are they using it only as a tool? Because what happens is, if you're attached to the outer form, you're trapped in the outer mind, the analytical thinking mind. And you're sitting there endlessly thinking. And you can see even Buddhists today have these discussions. This means that, or this means that, or very intellectual, very going back and forth. But the real question is, have you connected to the Buddha? And if you haven't, what are you doing? You're doing the same thing that all the other religious people are doing. You are fixated on the outer form of the teaching, rather than connecting to the being behind the teaching. It's like you're sitting there, you have a telephone book, a thick one, the New York telephone book, and you are looking through the telephone book and looking at all these names. And you're only fixated on the book. You never pick up the phone and dial. Hello? The reconciliation between the teachings I'm giving and Buddhism is connect to the Buddha. And the person here says, there's a teaching that is not conducive to dispassion, not conducive to the Dhamma, not conducive to liberation. Yes, liberation is connecting to the Buddha. And, and then I just want to comment on this. The person says, he's asking whether I think that my views can be reconciled with these teachings, or whether I do not. And then the person says, I am searching for the truth. See, that right there is your problem. It used to be my problem for the first many decades I was on a spiritual path. I was searching for the truth. But I was searching with my outer mind, my intellectual, reasoning, analytical mind. It took me a long time to recognize that, first of all, my mind is limited. And it will never grasp truth. Because truth cannot be reduced to something that the reasoning mind can categorize and label and put in a mental box. Furthermore, it took me a while to realize truth cannot be expressed in words. It's not a matter of finding the right words that reconciles this teaching with that teaching. It's a matter of saying, going beyond the outer form of the teaching and connecting to the spiritual being that gave the teaching, because that connection to the spiritual being, that is truth. All the other things, that's just the outer forms. It's just appearances. Truth is your direct experience of a spiritual being. That there is a spiritual being that is beyond the material, beyond your own mind, smarter than you, and you can connect to it. And you can experience that spiritual being, and that gives you a frame of reference for evaluating everything, not only in the outer world, but in your own mind. What's real and unreal. Because the spiritual being is real. And all this outer personality stuff, that's unreal.